Hi, I'd like to invite everyone to our mini lecture today, and it's going to be on the scientific method. So what we need to address is, what is the scientific method, and, well, do you have to be a scientist to use the scientific method? So let's start at the beginning. What is the scientific method? The scientific method is nothing more than an organized way to approach a problem and try to solve to get to a final answer. Can anyone use the scientific method? Absolutely. It just allows you to start asking questions that will lead to the final outcome or the conclusion. So first of all, what I'd like to do is just go ahead and tell you that if you look online or if you look in different textbooks, scientific methods will have different number of steps, but basically they all have one thing in common. They start with a question and they end with a conclusion. So on the board behind me, you can see that I drew out, and this is going to be one of the slides that is going to be in your presentation, and you can look on the whiteboard. That's another one of your slides that's in your digital notebook. So it says that this one is composed of questions, hypothesis, materials, procedure, observations, and then finally reaching our conclusion. So what I have for you today is an example of a scientific method, and that's over here, and I'm just going to read it to you to make it a little bit easier. It says, long ago, many people believed that living things could come from non-living things. They thought that worms came from wood and that maggots came from decaying meat. This idea was called spontaneous generation. In 1668, an Italian biologist, his name was Francisco Redi, did experiments to prove that maggots did not come from meat. One of his experiments is shown above. It says that Redi placed pieces of meat in several jars. He divided the jars into two groups. He covered his first group of jars with a very thin, fine cloth. He left the second group of jars uncovered. Redi observed the jars for several days. He saw flies on both the cloth and unclothed jars. He saw that the flies were laying eggs on the meat in the uncovered jars. He also noticed that maggots appeared only on the meat in the group that was uncovered. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to divide it up into here. So the question, what was Redi trying to do? Redi wanted to know if there was spontaneous generation. He wanted to know in his question, can living things come from non-living things? Now, I'm not going to fill these in. I'm just going to talk to you about them. But in your notebook, you have this exact scenario, and you also have this that you may want to open up a split screen and go with me and actually type in the answers as we go. All right, secondly, the hypothesis. What did he think was going to happen? Well, your hypothesis doesn't have to be correct. He could have stated, yes, that living things do come from can come from non-living things, or he may have stated, living things do not come from non-living things. So that was his hypothesis. Then the materials was, what does he need? Well, he needs jars, he needs some pieces of meat, and then he needs some coverings to go over them. So it's not a very difficult experiment. So when he gets ready to run this experiment, what is going to be his procedure? Now, you don't have to do a super detailed procedure, but you have to make a kind of a leap. He would, and they kind of went through and told what he did. He took the two jars, he puts meat in them, he covers half of them. I don't mind you cutting and pasting whenever you're filling in these as well. Then finally, what was his observations? Only maggots occurred in the meat in the jars that were uncovered. So what was his conclusion? His conclusion then came back around and said, hey, then living things must come from other living things. Or he could have went back to his original question and said that living things cannot spontaneously generate and come from a non-living thing. Now, I give you this scenario in your science notebook or in your digital notebook. You're going to see that I give you two more scenarios, and you're going to go through and number one, you're going to complete this scenario, and please use the video, type it in as you go, you can start and stop, and then you're going to do the next two scenarios. I hope that was helpful and scientific method.